Welcome back. Today we talk about ancient Rome. As you can see from the screen in front of you, they make a desert and call it peace. Ancient Rome from republic to empire. The quote comes from the Roman historian Tacitus, who, in a critical vein, criticizing his own country, his own empire, the Romans themselves, is saying there, we go into some other place uninvited, conquer it by brute, bloody force, and then impose our own law and order. And after the fact, say, "Hey, give us credit. We brought you peace." So, which does show, among other things, that Rome, at least some people in Rome, Tacitus at the very least, could be self-critical, critical of their own doings, their own policies, their own influence on the world. Some basic terminology and chronology, I think, is in order here before we move on. There are two definitions or different ways we'll use the word empire here. They're related, they overlap, but we should be able to distinguish between them. The first, this is the way we usually use the term empire today, is when one people or state government conquers and controls another less powerful foreign state, a group of people, culture. And the Romans are certainly doing that. We'll see them doing that from beginning to end of the history that we're going to cover in this unit. But empire also becomes a type of government as well. And you can see that in the timetable below. So historians divide the study of ancient Rome into two halves, more or less half. The first part, the Roman Republic, the second part, the Roman Empire. And what's the difference between the two? Well, among other things, and hence we get the labels Republic and Empire, that in the first half it was a republican system of government, meaning power was spread out to some degree. There was some element of public participation in government. And then it turned into an empire, or was turned into an empire. I want to use the passive voice there, which is a top-down authoritarian system ruled by an emperor. So in the second use of the word empire, it's a type of government, top-down authoritarian rule, led by an emperor himself. So they overlap. But one of the reasons that I think it's important to note this at the beginning and get it down is because even during the first half of the time period we're studying here, that we call the Roman Republic, the Romans were carving out an empire by force and military power in the first sense of the term. So it was already an empire based on definition number one, even when it was the Roman Republic. Then it was still an empire in that sense once it became an empire, which is easier to understand. I may have confused you more than helped you on this, but you can go back and listen to it again if you need to. So the Republic itself, basic, estimated beginning to the Republic around 500 BCE to about 30, so it's about 500 years. And the empire itself from around 30 BCE to about 500 CE, about another 500 years. So it's pretty neat and clean and symmetrical, dividing between the two systems. So first, the Roman Republic, as one book on the Republic says, of fairly recent origin, one of the most civilized societies in the ancient world. The Roman Republic was led not by monarchs ruling by divine right or heredity, but by elected executives whose power was checked by a constitution so well crafted that it inspired the founding fathers of the United States of America. One of those comparisons and similarities that I mentioned at the outset. In theory, even the weakest and poorest Romans had the protection of the law, and by and large their rights were respected. So this also shows us right off the bat that there are a lot of similarities between the Greeks, who we just covered, and the Romans. And certainly some of that is because the Greek culture and Greek ideas and Greek ways of doing things did have an influence in Italy, where, of course, Rome is. We didn't cover this other than very brief mention of it in the last unit, but the Greeks did send colonizers west through the Mediterranean, some of whom established Greek colonies in the southern part of Italy and Sicily, the island off the heel of the boot of Italy. So that's part of the reason, most likely, that we see some similar ideas because some Greeks settled in the southern part of Italy. There are other reasons as well. The incredible rise and collapse of the Roman Republic, that's not to say the whole Roman Empire as a whole, but the Republic in the first half of ancient Roman history sort of has this spectacular rise and spectacular fall, which is also true of the empire later on. And you could say then that the Roman Empire, just ancient Rome as a whole, had a spectacular rise and fall. So there's, in a sense, one big, long, 1,000-year rise and fall, and within that there are sort of two a bit smaller political rises and falls within the larger structure. But what we'll see here, I believe, is better than fiction, especially in the last 100 years of the Republic. Things get so crazy that it's hard to think that it could be real. The way to, I think, say it would be this: if you read a novel that included all of the events that we're going to talk about and some that we're not going to talk about, but that are relevant to explaining the last 100 years of the Roman Republic, and put it in fictional form, and you didn't know anything about the Roman Republic, you'd think, come on, this could never happen. It's unrealistic. And it is unrealistic, but there's just so many dramatic and unlikely, sometimes concurrent events going on back and forth, a lot of intrigue, a lot of drama, that it defies, actually seems to defy reality. So it is better than fiction in some ways. A really, really good book on Rome, this is the one I recommend, at least on the Republic itself, is the one I'm quoting here, author and title at the bottom of the screen. But he talked about two of the 7 famous hills in Rome. Rome was built sort of in between, kind of around the 7 hills of Rome as they're known. And one was called Palatine Hill, another called the Aventine. I'll only mention those two because they're in the quote. You can see from the map as well. The Palatine would be for winners, the Aventine for losers. Success and failure, prestige and shame, they're expressed in the very geography of the city, and were the twin poles around which Roman life revolved. Yet the valley that separated the two hills also joined them. Chariots had been racing around the Circus Maximus since the time of the kings, meaning the very beginning of the empire. The circus was easily Rome's largest public space, framed on one side by ragged shacks, on the other by graceful villas. This was where the city came together in festival. Up to 200,000 citizens might gather there. Here was where a citizen could be most publicly defined, whether by cheers of acclamation or by jeering and boos. Every senator who looked down at the circus from his villa, which would be on the Aventine Hill, was reminded of this. So too was every cobbler, shoemaker, who looked down from his shack, which would be on the Palatine Hill. So, I'm sorry, I said it the wrong way. Palatine for the rich, Aventine for the losers. My bad. For all the gulf that yawned between them, the ideal of a shared community still held firm for the millionaire and pauper alike. Both were citizens of the same republic. Neither Palatine nor Aventine was entirely an island after all. So the author here is sort of setting up geographically as well as politically, socially, economically, sort of a squaring off of the rich and the poor. The rich living on the Palatine Hill, at least some of the poor living on the Aventine Hill, but there was something always uniting them as Republican citizens. These are citizens, not subjects, like the Athenians basically became citizens and no longer subjects. And the physical, geographical connecting point was the Circus Maximus, huge stadium where they did all kinds of other public events as well, but it was mainly devoted to chariot racing and was gigantic, 200,000 people fitting in there. So the author uses the geography of the city sort of the map of the city to sort of show us that it's a good symbol of the larger political, cultural, social life of the city, which does see class conflict between rich and poor, but also, again, certain joining together as citizens. So who were the Romans, and what were they good at? They weren't like the Greeks in most ways. Although the two cultures are related. Remember, I already said that the Romans or the Greeks did send some settlers who colonized and stayed and ended up, having children and grandchildren, for good, settling in Italy. So there's that. But once the Romans became the big kid on the block in the Mediterranean and were the most powerful, we'll see they eventually conquered the Greeks as well as everybody else in the area. And then going back to the other direction, there was a further melding and bringing together of Greek and Roman culture. This is referred to usually by scholars very creatively as Greco-Roman culture. And so the Greco-Roman culture shows is a fusion of Greek and Roman ways of doing things to some degree. So to take one example, the Roman gods, Jupiter, for instance, the head of the gods, was taken from the Greek god Zeus. They're basically one and the same. There were some separate gods too, but for the most part, the Romans found it useful to start believing in the Greek gods. So there was a cultural affinity that's today, right, in the way we look at the history of the West in the term Greco-Roman. But there were some differences as well, but they ended up kind of complementing each other in a way. The Greeks, we know, were, the Spartans were tremendous fighters themselves. But since Athens is sort of the most famous and the most historically, I think, significant of the Greek city-states, has the most influence on what comes next in the Western world, the Athenians, we know, were more prone to, more known for, rightfully so, for philosophy and the arts and Greek tragedy, playwrights, historians, intellectuals, etc. So more known for culture. The Romans weren't as known for culture, and they therefore admired the Greeks and sort of took some of their culture, used some of the ideas from Greek philosophy. There are a few Roman philosophers of note, at least one of whom we'll mention coming up, but the Romans were much more down-to-earth, practical. So I'm making a stereotype here, big time. Those stereotypes sometimes have, not always, but sometimes have a grain of truth in them. In this case, I think they do. The Romans were a much more practical-minded lot who didn't sit around philosophizing. They acted. As Professor Perry, who I've quoted before, says, the Roman Constitution was not a product of abstract thought. It evolved gradually and empirically in response to specific needs. The Romans, unlike the Greeks, were distinguished by practicality and common sense, not by a love of abstract thought. In their pragmatic and empirical fashion, they gradually developed the procedures of public politics and the legal state. The Romans were good political leaders, good lawyers, good military leaders, good organizers, good engineers. You can see an aqueduct in the upper left there. The Romans invented cement. That's a good way to remember Roman practicality. It doesn't get much more practical than just hard cement used for the purposes of construction and building the infrastructure of an economy. So the Romans were good at doing and succeeding. They had kind of a go-getter, can-do attitude. Another way in which they're similar to Americans. I think it's part of the reason Americans find the Romans interesting, because they think that they're like us. So Americans have always had this can-do attitude. If you haven't heard the phrase, it means we can do it. We're confident. You got a problem? We'll fix it. We got a problem? We'll fix it. We're confident. We'll find a way to do it. Just get out of the way. Let us fix it. So the Romans had that kind of practical confidence in their abilities of leadership, engineering, technology, organization, etc. The Roman class structure Certainly, there was a lot of inequality and top-down structure, but like ancient Athens, saw before, since this is a republic, at least for now, uh, in Athens it was more of a democracy. They were pretty close, actually, in some ways, but let's not split hairs on this, no need to. But at one and the same time, there was inequality, but because of the idea of and legal reality of citizenship, it's not as top down as it would have otherwise been, and becomes later on once the republic itself collapses and an empire is put in its place. Norman Cantor, my go-to historian, in his great book Antiquity, says the prime motif of the first 2 centuries of the Republic was the struggle of the plebeian class, which means the masses of people, the average, it's kind of like middle class to working class, to gain some kind of parity with the patricians. Patrician class are the upper class, wealthy landowners, they're the political leaders, senators, and so forth. Their principal weapon was the threat of secession, meaning that of the plebeians. They prepared and several times actually carried out a complete withdrawal from Rome in order to establish a new state of their own nearby. The patricians were most responsive to this kind of pressure because plebeians made up the bulk of the military force of Rome. So the plebeians, since they were the overwhelming majority and were the backbone of the military, you can't do military operations without the mass of people involved. They always sort of use the threat of that, withdrawing their military service to chip away at a system that at first wasn't very democratic, wasn't a republic, but pushed and forced political leaders into giving one after another reform away, which caused Rome to evolve into a republic. The freedmen were former slaves who had been freed. Slavery in the ancient world, the ancient Mediterranean way, wasn't usually for life. It usually was for a certain amount of time, sometimes to pay off debts. Not that it was nice, but you could be freed. So the freedmen sort of have a better life, as you would expect, than slaves themselves, because they're now free. But they're still usually beneath the patricians and plebeians in their ability to rise on the socioeconomic ladder. And there was, of course, slavery in Rome. I'm not going to talk about it in depth for reasons of time here, but most slaves in Rome were captives in war. And depending on where you went or where you were sent, your life as a slave could be a quite different experience from someone else's. So if you got sent to the mines in Spain, your life as a slave was going to be brutal and probably short, worked to death most likely. But if somebody in Rome, a wealthy, powerful patrician, senator, thought you had talent or ability, they might take you on and educate you and make you kind of their personal secretary. And a personal secretary to a senator would be somebody of actual power. So sometimes slaves or an importance, sometimes slaves themselves and former slaves could rise in that sense. So slavery could be brutal and vicious, and whether your job was killing you as a slave, or it was a decent one like the desk job that the senator's secretary has, you're still not free. So it's no picnic. But slavery did differ from the slavery we're used to studying, which in many ways was far harsher than this one. I'm talking about the version of slavery in the Americas much later on. The economy of Rome was predicated largely, at least the wealth that started to pour in. The Romans started as kind of one small group of people around the 7 hills of Rome, one tribe, very rural, agricultural, kind of old-fashioned, small town, village type value system. But once they started to become wealthy and powerful and conquer lots of territory, they dominated the Mediterranean at the height of the empire, and the countries and kingdoms that ring it. You can see here, and did trade Mediterranean-wide, but also plundered Mediterranean-wide and beyond, all the way north to Great Britain, all the way into the Middle East. So Tom Holland says, business in the Bay of Naples, one of the cities in southern Italy, had always been international. At Puteoli, Roman businessmen had long since flattened all traces of Greek heritage. Huge concrete moles harbored ships from all over the Mediterranean, loaded with grain to feed Rome's monstrous appetite, and slaves to fuel her enterprises, but also rarities garnered from her far-off domains, sculptures and spices, paintings and strange plants. So there's trade. It usually is like conquer, plunder, helps reestablish their economy, the group that you've conquered and plundered, because now it's part of your economy, and then trade with it. Usually kind of went in that order. So you get a sort of specialization within the Roman Empire, meaning that certain areas were expected, encouraged to do one or a few products, manufacture this, grow that, and then trade across the to other parts of the empire. So there's already this kind of a specialization of the division of labor within the empire. But it started basically with plunder, and the Romans never really developed a strong, at least not in the heart of Rome, the Italian peninsula, a real strong manufacturing base. They had lots of trade and lots of plunder, but not as much manufacturing. I'm not saying none, but not as much. Urban development, not just in the city of Rome itself, in central Italy, but they conquered cities, basically, added to them in times in substantial ways. So Roman prowess in technology and organization certainly shows up in other parts of the empire. So it's not just urban development in the city of Rome, but it's all the cities that the Romans control, some of which you can see on the map there, sort of. Rome, according to a great historian, basically on economic history, said that Rome had better paved streets, sewage disposal, water supply, and fire protection than the capitals of civilized Europe in 1800. And that he's talking about Rome itself, the city, but that basically is true of the other cities that it conquered and then brought its own technology and know-how to bear on. Norman Cantor goes on and says the growth of the city produced enormous municipal problems that called for the expenditure of much money, effort, and administrative skill. Housing for the poor, better sanitation, and some sort of policing had to be provided. These projects made it possible for Rome to support such a vast population, and later measures sought to provide cheap and free food. Thus, the city of Rome became a sprawling, multiracial community encompassing some of the wealthiest and poorest people in the world. The streets were usually crowded and dirty, and passage through them at night was a mortally dangerous affair. Rome was a place of excitement, opportunity, and frequent danger. It was clearly the hub of the world, or it was thought to be the hub of the world, is what Cantor is saying, and was the hub of the Mediterranean world, to be sure. But there were certainly lots of problems in cities, some of which were, used to even now. I think it sometimes surprises students that some of the same urban issues that we have today go all the way back this far. But that's, of course, true in the urban areas and other parts of the world that we've already looked at. So even ancient cities had big issues with sanitation, and inequality, and policing, and crime, and these kinds of things. As far as Roman government is concerned, under the Republic, again, this didn't all come at once. I'm kind of skipping ahead for reasons of time. But when the republic evolved into its kind of complete structure, there were 2 consuls, executive heads of government, about 300 members of the Senate, and the assembly. Actually, there were a number of assemblies, but let's just call it the assembly for simplicity's sake. But much like the Athenian system, the assembly was made up of average citizens that got to vote on important matters and measures. So once again, this is direct representation and not sort of indirect as we're used to today. So people didn't elect politicians to vote for laws that would accommodate them, but they voted themselves. 2 consuls basically means there were like 2 presidents, 2 kings. They each served a 1-year term, and you could repeat as consul. There were a few famous Romans that served several times as consul. But why have 2 heads of state? Doesn't that just confuse things and make it more difficult? What if they disagree? Well, yeah, then you have a stalemate. But the point was to sort of hedge for risk. So if one consul goes nuts and and goes off half-cocked and orders something to be done that doesn't, it's crazy, the other consul can veto it. So both consuls have to agree before things get done. So it can slow things down, but it can also prevent disaster, and that's what it was designed to do. The senatorial class didn't vote on the laws, right? That's the average citizen that does that in the assembly. But the senators basically framed the laws, basically put them into place, made the speeches like we saw the Athenian aristocracy do, the Greek aristocracy in Greece. So another similarity between the two. They also directed, sort of made the decisions about budget, controlled the budget, and made the spending decisions, etc. They could disapprove of laws passed by the assembly as well, and so in some cases they could overrule it, although that sometimes had fairly high costs attaching to it.